which has been affectionately referred to as Charter Review Boot Camp. And that's by Drill Sergeant Churuti here. And I guess the idea behind it is you want to have seasoned professionals, to train your folks, to train your troops. And it takes time, dedication, and consistency to learn how to spot opportunities and challenges. And we have here collectively over 115 years of experience in the public service, and so I'll ask you to do the math. I dare not inquire the clerks or the young lady of Richmond. Okay, so with that, I lost my train of thought here. So with that being said, I've got Clerk Inzer, Florida Gator.
Does he look like a Florida Gator? Yeah.
I realize that he is a Gator at heart because the nation is huge. And so, well, I got Clerk Inzer, generally good guy. I've got Buddy here to my left, Florida Gator, and I've got Miss Churuti here, Drill Sergeant. And so with that being said, I'll turn it over to Buddy. Thank you.
All right. Don't leave me, Charles. He talks all this drill sergeant stuff, but what he didn't tell you is he also put 8 years in the Army, so let's give him a hand.
Does everybody know our MC here? No. You want to do a self-introduction?
This is Charles. Charles, tell us a little bit. He's new with the staff. Tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so I came on board with the association late October of last year. I'm currently still served in the United States Army Reserve. I've got, this year will be 13 years in, a wife and 4.5 kids. And so, we love the youngins. I want to see this one come all the way through, and then I think I may hit pause at 5. But yeah, so I'm working with the accounting side of the house, which I thoroughly enjoy, and sitting in and at least having some of the clerks' perspectives about the challenges that you guys face have been very informative, and so I think I found a good place to be.
All right. We're very happy to have you on our team. Today's about charter government. How many of y'all already are in a charter county? So get a feel, so Susan. Okay, and then the rest are going to learn a little bit about it here today. But we appreciate you taking time. I know a number of us have spent 4 hours in ethics this morning and 2 hours in etiquette. So we ought to do something about how to do something. I don't know what. But anyway, it's we're going to let Susan's going to do most of the talking. And Bob and I and Barry Baker, we're going to tell stories whenever we feel like Susan needs a break. But other than that, we're going to kick it off. And Susan Churuti is an attorney, as you can see. She represents clients around the state and works with counties and charter government throughout the state. And so she's quite an expert on this. Appreciate Ken bringing her to our attention. And we're looking forward to your leading us through this seminar. So Susan, we'll turn it over to you, and Bob are over here. Bob and I are over here eating the goodies that we just got if you need it. All right, it's all yours.
And I'm going to let everyone jump in as they feel the urge to do that. Just pull up the microphone and speak into it if you have any questions. I'm also going to split the room into 2 halves. And everybody on this side of the room is going to take the position for the incumbent clerk. And everybody on this side of the room is going to make arguments against the current clerk. So, and these are in a charter review context. So, I'm Susan Churuti, and along with Clerk Buddy Irby, Clerk Bob Inzer, and Clerk Barry Baker, I'm here to talk to you about charter review issues. And I want to thank Ken Burke for inviting me to come. I am with the law firm of Bryant, Miller & Olive, which is the largest municipal finance firm in Florida. We are bond counsel to over 200 cities and to over half the counties. And to some of you on the BCC side of the house, you may recognize my name because I got back $220 million for 62 of the 67 counties by suing the state of Florida on Medicaid reimbursement. When I tell my private practitioner friends, about the litigation, which was a constitutional challenge and also a political challenge, they say, gosh, that must have been a great contingency fee. And I was like, no. Miami-Dade County paid the highest amount, and it was $5,000, and I think they got back $14 million. So I am interested in your jobs. I served in Pinellas County in the county attorney's office for 27 years before I joined Bryant, Miller, and Olive 8 years ago. I left brochures in the back relating to Bryant, Miller, and Olive, and I also, for those of you on the finance side, I have a little handout on post-issuance compliance on preserving your debt's tax exemption. And you may want to pick one of those up. It relates to the services that Lori Scott, who is at Integrity, provides in order to allow finance directors and clerks in that capacity to ensure that you, once the debt is issued, you have to proactively monitor it. And she can help you do that. So, that being said, we're going to get started by saying we're here to talk about the challenges and opportunities and what these are. Part of the reason, when I talk about charters, part of the reason I think that I'm the appropriate county attorney to talk to you, or former county attorney, is because every charter is different. And in Pinellas County, my charter job description said I had to represent the sheriff, the property appraiser, the tax collector, the supervisor of elections, and the clerk of the circuit court. So I did that, and I took that job very seriously, and I did it for 27 years. So I think I understand a lot about your positions and what you do. I understand both the Article 5 side and the Article 8 side of your jobs, and I understand what the challenges are potentially to clerks in a charter review scenario. I also have represented city and county charter commissions, and I do a lot of constitutional litigation. So I think that when I first started thinking about how to introduce myself to the topic, I thought, well, on the Article 5 side, we used to go in before they changed the Constitution and made the Article 5 cost more of a state obligation. Back when the counties were paying for more than half of it, every Tuesday I would send an assistant county attorney into criminal court to talk about the expenditures and what the county had to pay for, and to talk about public defenders being appointed and costs. And actually, the chief judge and the public defender and I selected the conflict lawyers for public defenders. So when the PD had a conflict, we got together and we selected an attorney. So we have a kind of a character on criminal court in Pinellas County, and when he was in private practice, he was appointed to a death penalty case. And the judge looked down at him when he was appointed and said, now, Frank, I want you to understand that the defendant is a psychopath. And Frank said, that's okay, Judge, I speak psychopath. So I speak clerk, and that's part of the reason that I'm here. I wanted to analogize what my goal is today, and the best analogy I could come up with was being trained to manage a national incident. And I'm sure you all have activations of your Emergency Operations Center. Some of you go into the EOCs and you provide notice of the Board of County Commissioners meetings when they have to meet during a hurricane, know about the things that happen. And one of the things I had to do was I had to be trained to manage a bird flu pandemic, which is essentially the same as the 1917 pandemic, which was very lethal around the United States. And I think that you are all in today, you're in a very collegial, happy group of people that are all supportive of each other, and you all understand what each other does. And that's the best place for you to deal with problems that you may have in the future that may confront you and may be hard to answer. So I want you to be together and to hear about some of the arguments you may be facing in a Charter Review Commission or the Constitutional Revision Commission, and to be prepared to answer those. So, what did I have to find out? Well, Morris Udall was the Secretary of Health and Human Services at the time, and he had 51-hour meetings with each of the 50 states for all of the emergency workers simultaneously when we thought we were going to have a bird flu epidemic. And so everyone in Florida got on the same telecast webinar from Morris Udall, who basically said, I don't think you know how bad this is. It's going to be terrible, and you're going to have to deal with it. And I'm from Utah, so I went and I read all the newspapers for my small hometown in Utah to find out what happened in 1917. And he said, really, the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, there really weren't a lot of problems in my small hometown. But then a group of kids and parents from a church went to Salt Lake City for a Sunday school convention, and when they came back, they were infected. And I started to see the numbers increase as I would read the paper every day through the pandemic. And the only doctor in town got the disease and died. And it was a pretty difficult situation. And it's kind of like the oil spill, which was managed by the Coast Guard. The pandemics are actually managed by the veterinarians. So it is USDA who manages bird flu. The good news is they're pretty competent people. The bad news is that we had to then practice the first scenario that they had prepared for us to run through as a mock bird flu incident. And the San Francisco Angels flew to Tampa Bay to play a baseball game. People started having flu symptoms. We started getting the reports, like real time from the emergency rooms, and within 24 hours, every first responder was dead. Every receptionist who admitted them into the hospital, every EMT, every police officer, every doctor, they were all dead. And we had to implement a quarantine law, which was pretty tough. I sat in the Emergency Operations Center, and I found out that every hotel that we had in the entire county that had a restaurant was going to be a hospital. So that we just had you're given a map. This is every hotel that has food services, and it's going to be full of people, and they're all going to be critically sick. So I turned to the FDLE and I said, we're going to have a heck of a time enforcing this quarantine. First of all, we're supposed to knock on people's doors and tell them to bring the vector animal that passes the disease, which turned out to be their family dogs. So we're supposed to, sheriff deputies are supposed to knock on the door and say, could you give me your dog so that we can euthanize it? And then we have to control the borders. And in Pinellas County, we have 42 miles of coastline. We're a big peninsula. Tampa Bay on the east, the Gulf of Mexico on the west. And I turned to the FDLE, and I beside me, and I said, we're never going to be able to control that. We've got 200,000 boats in Pinellas County. And he said, yeah, we will, because we're sending the 10th Mountain Division. At which point I said, that's how I can tell I've been federalized, when you send mountain troops to Pinellas County where the highest place is 11 feet above sea level. And he said, no, Susan, they're your snipers. And I was like, oh my. So the good news is, if you think about it in a collegial group, and you have to deal with it as a clerk, if you think about it a year in advance, and you prepare yourselves for it, and you have plenty of time to psychologically get used to the idea that your offices may be abolished, or somebody may be coming in and saying, we really don't need any court clerks that are Article 5 officers, we're just going to adopt the federal system. If you hear those things here first, I'm hoping that's going to be you. So, here's the Florida Constitution. 1821, Andrew Jackson, our governor, he issues the first ordinance. He divided the state into 2 counties. What are counties? Well, they're subdivisions of governments from France. In England, they had shires, so the word shire reef became sheriff. In 1868, the governor appointed all the treasurers, all the county officers, including the treasurers. In 1885, the first counties were formed, and they could be formed, amended, or abolished by the legislature as subdivisions of the state. That's very important. When you get a microphone stuck in your face and say, why shouldn't you be like the city's function where the finance officer works for the city manager or the mayor, you could say, because I'm a subdivision of the state. And you have statewide functions. So theoretically, when I teach constitutional law, I tell students that cities, we look to municipal corporate law. So we say, we look to the law that applies to IBM. When we look to counties, we look to the state of Florida. And we say, you're a political subdivision of the state. So in 1968, the electors of Florida granted local voters the power to adopt charters. Dillon's rule was abolished, and that rule said you don't have any power unless the legislature specifically gives it to you, which meant the legislature was constantly passing special acts for 67 counties, giving them the power to do all kinds of mundane things. And now we have home rule. What does that mean? If it's not prohibited by the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, the Florida Constitution, general statute or special act, you could do it. So you're really just limited by your own imagination. And some charters are pretty imaginative. Hallandale Beach, they amend their charter without an election. There's 410 cities. Only one of them can amend their charter and not go to the voters. Here's what the language of Article 8, Section 1G provides. You have all powers of local government not inconsistent with general law or special law approved by the electors. So what do you take from that? Well, you should say that we're looking at the legislature preempting you. So when the Miami-Dade County for a long time, Bob Ginsburg, my friend, used to teach Article 8, he used to say, we all have home rule unless the legislature's in session. And then they can take away any part of it. So preemption is when the legislature acts. I think that I'm going to be dealing with three major issues: abolition of your offices, term limits, and reduction of your compensation. I think, for example, compensation is inconsistent with general law. So what is charter government? Well, it's kind of in our DNA. We're having the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. It's not really a municipal charter. This is probably the first municipal charter. And it goes back to (1373). And there's Queen Elizabeth, who, when she went to Ireland, that was the one thing she wanted to see, the charter granting municipal powers to the city of Waterford, where all of our crystal comes from. And the charter roll is 12 feet long. And they just kept killing sheep and attaching sheepskins to it and drawing pictures of kings and rocking on. So, you know, we think that gay marriage is a new thing, but in fact, in 1385, King Edward II, who was too close to his male advisors, was murdered by his French wife and her lover, and his picture was excised from the Waterford Charter. So, what is charter government? It's a formal written documents that confer powers, duties, or privileges on the county. They may resemble state or federal constitution, generally approved by the electorate, generally to remove the resolution of local problems from the state. What is a charter government? Well, there are two types of charters. There are state constitutional charters, and those are Duval, Hillsborough, Miami-Dade, and Monroe. When those charters were created, the entire state had to vote on them. So when they wanted to create the powers for the clerk in Miami-Dade County, if you lived in Escambia County or you lived in Gadsden County, you got to vote on that because you were giving up part of the sovereignty of the state. I have the dates that those happened. And these are the list of current charter counties. These are the counties where right now we have charter governments. So a little bit about how these are adopted. The election law is that there is no single subject rule. Unlike state constitutional amendments, you always hear they're going to the Florida Constitution to see if they are fair, if they violate the single subject rule. Well, we don't have that in counties, unless it's in the charter itself, which some do. I was hired by Brevard County to be on their charter sort of person who gives a constitutional opinion before it goes to the electorate as to whether or not it violated their own charter provision on single subjects. Once a charter amendment is provided or created and goes on the ballot, judges can't change them. That's pretty important. When Mrs. de Blaker's Turnovit's case went to the Supreme Court, and I was her lawyer when that happened, the judge thought maybe because the county commissioners who were in the same ballot question, maybe they wouldn't rule on that, but really there was one question and they can't guess what the electorate would do if the charter language read a different way. So that's a pretty important principle. There is a lot of times, and I did this in Pinellas County with term limits, I tried to stop the election. That's pretty much an uphill battle, but it does happen sometimes. So you need to be aware that that's a remedy. If you see something saying, I think we're going to cut your salary in half, you may want to get an injunction, or at least draw the attention to the public that this is going on, that an injunction will provide you. We still have provisions relating to fairness of the language, and honestly, I have a very hard time telling when something is fair. I don't think the case law is very clear. I've had several of these cases, and I think maybe that's something that would be a good idea for the Constitutional Convention to take up. Well, if you're not a charter county, if you're not on this list, why would you want to be a charter county? Well, here are some reasons that charter commissions give counties that have decided they wanted to charter. These are some of the reasons that they gave. Tailored structure, given more power, could provide for citizen initiative. They would have an option to, there are a lot of powers that are unique to charter governments. I looked at one this morning. I think it was a rental car surcharge, a TDC tax, and only certain counties could do it. Sometimes only charter counties can do these things. They may provide for the method of election or appointment. Okay, what does that mean? Not whether you're nonpartisan, whether you can be recalled, what's the length of your term, and how many terms can you serve. Whether salaries can be included is unclear. I come down on the side, no, I don't think so. But good lawyers have given charter commissions opinions saying, yes, you can. The other thing that's a benefit, depending upon how you feel about your legislative delegation, is that they cannot pass special acts within the borders of your county unless the electorate approves. So it actually takes power away from the legislature. So if the legislature wanted to adopt a special act in your charter county, they actually have to get the approval of your electorate. There are some disadvantages, and here are some disadvantages to being a charter county. Probably the most important would be local government could refuse to participate in solutions to area-wide or statewide problems. What are some common charter issues for clerks? As I mentioned, loss of your related independence, that watchdog function. I think it's important for you to be able to articulate the in local government. And I'll just say Ken Burke is a friend of mine, and when I was going through a grand jury issue and taking 56 county employees with me, Ken would send me quotes from Winston Churchill. And I have one for you, which is that I will be treated well by history because I intend to write it. And he did. We had his 50th anniversary of his funeral last week, and one of the commentators mentioned that the reason Winston Churchill was so powerful and such a good intellect in terms of really restructuring the shape of the world, drawing maps all over the world. He partitioned Pakistan, he drew Palestine, he really rewrote all the boundaries in Eastern Europe, was because he knew history and he knew geography. And in your counties, who holds the records on your county history and your county geography? The clerks of the circuit court do that. We don't really think about the role of records in a society, but when catastrophes happen, it becomes apparent how key that is. And one example that I use when I teach law school is to say that there are no written records of either the Inca or the Aztec civilizations, although they had extensive libraries and extensive written materials. And the reason was that their culture was that when they went to war, the first thing they destroyed was the records. When Castro took over Cuba, the State Department set up a claim system for people fleeing the Cuban government where they could reconstitute their records so that when Castro fell or relationships were normalized, that people would be able to prove what they owned because he destroyed all the records. So those are the records that are the equivalent of the records that you hold. So I think that you can see that we don't really like to talk about public corruption or violent overthrow of the government, but really, there's a lot of opportunity for mischief if someone who is motivated with the wrong ideas decides to change the history of what happened in your county to support their purposes. And I happen to like reading historical fiction, and I've been reading books by Alan First, which are very historically accurate, and they all are around the time, I say 1938 to 1946, all set in Europe. And they highlight what happened to common people. You know, what happened in Paris when the Nazis were going to be there in 48 hours. What happened in Berlin when the Russians were coming in to partition Berlin into 4 sectors. What did the Americans do to protect the Berliners? And one of the things that he mentioned was, where was the tipping point when an average policeman in Germany looked at something that had been a crime the day before, and because it was an action that was perpetrated by brown shirts who now were constitutionally empowered to do that, it became a political action. And all of a sudden, the same violent act that he would have arrested them for the day before became something where he was really powerless to do anything. So I think that you want to keep that watchdog function and be proud of the watchdog function that you have. I think it's important to society, and I think that you, in my experience, clerks are very high-minded, independent, conscientious people who are not going to let local elected officials run over them. So what are some of the limitations that charters can put into you if they abolish your constitutional office and they make you an appointed official? Well, in Florida, I think it was 1968, the Miami-Dade County manager fired the sheriff. And everybody just thought, that can't happen, that can't be right, that a manager can fire a sheriff. And the case went to the Supreme Court. They'd abolished the sheriff's office, they made him a charter officer, and the Supreme Court said, sure, you can fire the sheriff, he's department director. It's the same as a mayor firing a police chief. And really, you know, you have other analogies with the other constitutional officers within your counties that are good. You could say, well, you know, if the owner of the Tampa Bay Rays is speeding on the way home and he gets stopped by a St. Pete PD officer, and he says, do you know who I am? I'm a friend of the mayor's. That police officer may give some pause and say, hey, gosh, you're pretty important to the community. I know the city has a big contract with you. Whereas if it's a sheriff's deputy that arrests him or stops him, he's going to be, if he gets a lot of resistance, he may say, well, why don't you get in the back of my cruiser and you can tell me all about yourself when I drive you to the jail. So...
Is this a purely fictional case?
It's a purely fictional case. But having represented cities that have police chiefs and represented sheriffs, I see the difference. And those of you who have worked for a sheriff probably also see that difference. I'm doing some work now for Fort Myers, and I had an interesting scenario with them. I had to go into our firm went into federal district court. They had an appointed police chief, and they are a pre-clearance jurisdiction, which means that the Justice Department is going to look at every election action that they take, because they have a history of voting rights violations, a well-documented history. They have problems with race relations in Fort Myers, historically. But the black community decided they didn't like police brutality, and they wanted to elect the police chief. Well, federally, constitutionally, that's a dilution of the black vote. Now they have 2 black commissioners out of 5. They control 40% of the vote. If they went to a countywide or a citywide election, they would be diluting their vote. So I'm being tasked, and frankly, I was pretty impressed that the mayor said, if it's going to make them happy and they think that's important, let's let people vote on it. And if that's going to make our community heal, okay. So I'm getting ready to go into federal district court and tell the Justice Department and the federal judge, we're in a pre-clearance jurisdiction and I want to dilute the vote. Well, that's a pretty uphill battle. But when you explain, this is a petition from the black community, these are the organizations and churches that feel that this would be a helpful thing for the community, all of a sudden, pretty much all that federal precedent goes away. So I think that having an elected clerk, having an independent clerk, that can be a positive thing. So, what are some of the constitutional watchwords that we use for the balance of power? Well, we talk about separation of powers. And we have, essentially, we have as overarching principles for your offices. We have on one side a watchdog function, separation of powers, balance of authority, checks and balances. That's who you are now. The other side, we have modernization, standardization, efficiency, expense. So let's think about whether or not those are important in the context of your officers. And you know a lot more about them than I do. I know a certain amount, I'm somewhat educated as to the role of clerk, but you know really what you do on a day-to-day basis, what these arguments are. I will say that Pinellas County was a hot spot for Bush versus Gore, and I represented the supervisor of elections and the commission that was going to certify the election results. Canvassing board, and the chairman of the canvassing board, who was the county commissioner. And we had 22 cases that were filed simultaneously against the canvassing board and the supervisor of elections. And we started working our way through the system of sending out lawyers to federal and state court. There was Bush, Texas, Bush, US, Bush, Florida. We had injunction cases, we had citizen cases, we had public records cases. And I was watching my canvassing board and what we were doing. And I was also watching my friend Denise Nyman, who was the Palm Beach County attorney, and what she and her canvassing board were doing. Well, in Pinellas County, we have sheriff's deputies pick up the ballots at every precinct. And they bring them to one place, and they lock them in the back of police cruisers, and they bring them with their lights on. And we account for everything pretty much within an hour after the poll closes. In Palm Beach County, they had, 3 days later, they still had poll workers who had taken ballots home. So when you have a national election at stake, and you have been given the national responsibility of tabulating the election returns, maybe that's an argument in favor of standardization. Maybe we ought to have we could do that by having a state law. We could do it by harmonizing the provisions, taking away that home rule for supervisors of elections. But really, you have to see that there are going to be arguments like that on the other side. So, on the finance side, I gave a lecture to the Florida Association of Public Procurement Officers, which was, how can we read all of those statewide grand jury presentments and tell how the law's going to change in the future for procurement officers? And the answer was, you could read the statewide grand jury presentment in Broward County for the school board, and every school board employee who is involved in the building of schools got a brand new kitchen. Not just a new refrigerator, but a new granite countertop, new flooring, new cabinets, all new appliances. So obviously there's a function for a check and balance on the finance side. I think that when we look at the independence issues, well, there's some budget approval now. Performance audits. Who can do a performance audit of your office, and who could you do a performance audit on? Are you more or less responsive than an appointed clerk or finance director? And how would your offices be affected if there were uniform support services? That means you would have to use the county purchasing department, the county IT, county audit function, the county legal department, the county risk management, county personnel to hire your employees, and the fleet management. So that's the big picture of checks and balances, and I'll talk about term limits and compensation issues a little later. So we have some language. Not all of these are current provisions in current charters, but they're really to show you some examples of what charters can do. Okay, here you go. They were abolished in 1996. Property appraiser, the tax collector, and the sheriff. I think the sheriff was then unabolished. They were reestablished, and it took effect on this date. And they retained them in office. And then they became essentially department directors. So that's how that happened. Here's the Alachua County. This was in 1987, not the current Alachua County, which we'll be talking in a little bit about what the changes were in Alachua. But This is a status quo provision. It says you can't do anything to them. Brevard County.
We had a Alachua County just.
Yeah, go ahead.
We had what a lot of ways start. We could just call it a starter charter, which is very basic. The county commission in general was saying, we're not concerned about the constitutional officers. We'll leave you alone. That's what is still up there. You know, all of your duties, all your responsibilities, everything stays exactly the same. You're still a constitutional officer. We just want the authority from the county government. Now, of course, what that means is through initiative or through charter revision commissions, that stuff can change. So far, we've changed nothing in particular dealing with constitutional officers, but other things that we'll talk about later. We have what's called, what you'll see a lot, starter charter, very basic.
In Dallas County, we had such a hard time passing our starter charter that the clerk at the circuit court at the time got a provision put in it to say you can't abolish the constitutional officers without the permission of the legislature. So that's really a status quo charter. It's like not only do you have what you already have, we're going to put an additional barrier up forward. Here's Brevard County language. Leon, again, they remain independent, but there's a clerk auditor provision. And you can talk about that now, or you can talk about it later. Why don't you go ahead and fill us in on what happened in your experience?
Let me, I think, can y'all hear me without the microphone?
Yeah.
My voice carries pretty well. Let me say that the county commission came to me back in 2002 and said that they wanted to create a charter government and wanted to know whether I would support it. And I told them, well, it depends on the charter. But I said, generally speaking, I support charter governments. And the reason I do is I believe that it gives the citizens more control over their government because they can put their own initiatives, they have home power, and I believe those are good things for the citizens to have. So I worked with the county commission on that, and included in the language in the charter, this language that is included here, was the auditor function. Now, we had an audit function before then, but I wanted to basically go ahead and have that included in the charter because there's a couple things that I've done. One is we actually have two sections to it. The second section I'll just drop down to, it really talks about an audit committee. The audit committee is a 5-member committee of which the county commissioners appoint 2, and I basically appoint the other 3 that are responsible for oversight of the audit function. The first is I employ the auditor, and we basically have qualification standards that are actually in charter. We want to make sure that this is, and let me say that I believe very strongly in an audit process, and I also believe very strongly in an audit process. Here's the goal of the audit from my perspective. Okay? From my perspective, you're trying to identify risk, you're trying to identify inefficiencies, you're trying to propose, if you will, solutions that take away with inefficiencies for those risks, and lastly, you want implementation of that. So we want buy-in, if you will, from your elected officials. When I first came into office, it was an audit function. I was there, and I sat down with my county commission, and I said, and there have been a lot of kickback and a lot of resentment to the audit function prior to this because it was highly publicized. The audits were actually, the audit function to some extent was used as a weapon against the county commissioners and the county administrator. And I said, that's not what I'm about. That's not the way we'll operate it. And since I've been there, we've never had any of our audits published in the paper. It's never been quoted in the paper. They're a public record. I'm not trying to suggest that I'm trying to cover them up, but it's one thing to send them out to the press. It's another thing to have them available. And I'll also tell you that I've got almost 100% support for the recommendations that we've made through our audits as far as implementation. So my county basically has, if you will, biased in, if you will, to the recommendation. Well, this was adopted and was put in the charter, and things were rocking along pretty well until there was some problems with other audits around the states and the other auditors, and my county attorney basically came up and said, well, the audit function is voluntary, but the county commission really doesn't charter. I said, it's in the charter. How can you say that? He says, well, Bob, it says, as provided by law. And he says, show me where in the law that it provides for the clerk to have an audit function. And when the charter was done, one of the big things that the county commission went out for was saying, we're going to now have this auditor function in the charter. And I said, Herb, who is the county attorney, I said, I look forward to having the public discussion, because there were the tapes that they had actually put together about promoting this, and how you wrote this language that says provided by law, that you said really was not effective, and how the county commission snookered the citizens to suggest that this language was actually going to be there. I said, I'm looking forward to that public discussion. Well, he dropped that issue and it just went away. And so you realize that was not a public discussion that he really wanted to have. In 2010, there was a review of the audit, review of the charter, and I proposed taking that language out as specified by law. And it went to the Charter Review Commission, and at that point in time, interestingly enough, the head of the Charter Review Commission was, in fact, the executive director of the Bar Association of Counties. So I went and made the presentation to the entire committee. Everybody says, that sounds good, sounds reasonable, just go ahead. And they directed the county attorney to take the language out. Well, the language came back, and in fact, the language I did take that section out, even though it was never recommended, never said that. He also included in language that said that all of the audits, the audit plans, and anything the auditor could do had to be approved in advance by the county commission. So it took away the entire independence of the auditor to decide what needed to be audited, and the audit committee. So I took that to the audit committee, and let me say my audit committee is made up of some relatively high-powered people. They're heads of major CPA firms, the head of the audit function for one of the regional banks, head of the inspector generals. So these are all knowledgeable, well-connected people, and I basically showed them the language, and they went ballistic. They said, that takes away all the independence function that was expressed in the language. So they wrote an interesting letter to the audit committee, and basically that language went away. One thing I would say about all this is a couple points. One is I'm a great believer in an audit committee process. I believe that they become advocates for you and for the office. They depoliticize it. Ron Webster, who has served on that, has served as chairman, by the way, of my audit committee in the past, and I want to thank you for your service.
Yes, sir.
And hopefully I've expressed this accurately.
Yes.
So these are people that believe in what we're doing. They review the audits. It's a very non-political process. They review, if you will, the audit plans. They look at the risk assessments that we do. And they, like I said, they are advocates, if you will, for this function and this purpose. So the one thing I guess the takeaway that I would say from all of this is I still believe, by the way, in the charter form of government, so it didn't change mine, but it also, you have to be very aware that it can change, and you are at greater risk. Let me just be very candid about that. Because absent this, they can't abolish your job until they go through the charter process, and they can't change your responsibilities. The charter actually can give them that authority. It has to go to the people. But I believe that it's incumbent upon us, if you will, to bring institutions and to bring processes in place that support, if you will, the activities and functions of your office, that demonstrate the quality of what you're doing and the value, if you will, of what you're doing. And we've been successful in basically beating those issues back. Again, this is all because of one individual who believes very, and then again, part of it goes back to the history prior to me coming there and how the audit function was used by my predecessor. So you need to make sure that your audit function really is professionally handled and is geared to improving the quality of government for the citizens of your county. And those are the only comments I would make.
Does anybody have any questions about the Leon model? here's the language in Orange County. And this language here, including performance audits, expands the constitutional power of the clerk in a non-charter county. So it could be a positive thing.
They're the only charter that provides this language in the state of Florida. So I think Marty's the only individual, Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're the only individual that has the ability to audit other constitutional officers. Is that correct?
As far as I know.
And do performance audits. Most of us don't do that.
Palm Beach County, again, status quo. They added the state attorney and public defender. So sort of suggesting that maybe the county can change an Article 5 function. I don't think that's constitutional, but it happens. There are counties that turn over the school board. I don't think that's constitutional, but it happens. This is the Pinellas County Charter, and again, this is the charter that requires the approval of the legislature to change the power of duties of the constitutional officers. This is Wakulla, again saying it will not be altered by the Home Rule Charter. I'm just going to run through some examples of how different charters treat clerks of the circuit court. How many different models there are? Well, there's a lot of them. So you can see Broward, the clerk collector were both abolished and transferred to the Department of Finance, but a commission audit was created. In Clay, the clerk's duties were transferred to the county administrator, so he gets to spend the money and audit himself. Well, there is a commission audit created. Duval, there's a council auditor. Miami-Dade, they abolished the charter. They are now charter officers, which is the opposite of being a constitutional officer. So they abolished their constitutional status, so they appoint the sheriff in Miami-Dade County. Orange, again, has an elected comptroller, and the comptroller audits all of the constitutional officers. Osceola, the clerk's duties are transferred to the county administrator, and an auditor is created.
Which duties specifically are you talking about in Osceola?
Those are the finance duties.
Okay, I'll Which one?
Right. Yeah, not the Article 5 duties. Volusia, again, the sheriff, the appraiser, the supervisor are elected charter officers, but they abolished all of the constitutional officers. Charter possibilities. They can divide the office of the clerk of court and the comptroller. They can transfer duties to another office. Here's an example of that.
Question, I
Yeah.
think, can't you actually create and divide the clerk's function even without being a charter office?
Yes, you can by constitution and by statute.
Right, you don't
Correct.
have to create a charter or do that.
Right. And so here again is the Leon auditor in the charter and how that works. If Clerk Barry Baker's here, he can talk to us about the Swanee River experience.
I think that's what Bob was just talking about there.
It's a thing in our county, it's where this past year we had a situation where the board had tried to take the finance function away from our office and put it underneath the Board of County Commissioners. And during that time, it's where I will tell you it was a very trying time. I worked very closely with John Crawford's office as well as Bob Inzer's office. And at the end, it's where the issue was dropped. I will tell you that I learned a lot more about my office and about my duties during that time because I was having to check everything by statute and also by its rulings that had been in effect prior. It's Curtis. It's exactly right. It's Powers versus Alachua County and Broad versus Collier. And so it's where those, there's a lot of, at the end it's where that the issue is dropped, but it's where that, it was not a fun time, but it's where that at the end it's where that, I had spoke to the last class, and it's where if you go through these, if you go through these times and trials and you don't learn anything coming out the backside of it, it's where it's a wasted opportunity. But it's where that this was a chance that when it was over with, I actually went to the commissioners and spoke to them to try and find out what all had led up to this. And it's where there was a growing time as well. And it's where that in doing so, I was able to find out some of the fault actually lie with our office and with me. And so it's where I was, you can take and use these times as a time in which you throw your sucker in the dirt and go home and pout, or you can use it as a time to grow. We chose to use it as a time to grow, and it's where that our office has made some changes. I think that they have also made some changes, and we have tried to use the time to take and to grow stronger in the end. But it's not something I would wish on any of y'all, I'll tell you that.
Gary, they didn't do that as a charter county, did they?
It was not done as a charter. It's where we are a constitutional officer in our county, and it's where we do not have a charter. But it's where that I didn't know if that's what it was leading up to at the time.
Eric?
Yes, sir.
How's this, I mean, it's ended in your favor, but why did it come to an end? Like, what was the motivating factor which made them stop pursuing this? Or
it's where that we had gotten a lot of information from John Crawford's office as well as Bob's. We had a gentleman from Fred Baggett's office. His name is John Londive, and John had represented other counties in the same situations. And John came in. Our commission at the time had told us that they would give us 2 weeks because that they were. It came about. It was the last at the final budget hearing that a motion was made that they would take the budget office away from our office. They wanted to transfer our employees and to take and put it under the direction of the Board of County Commissioners. It's where that I had told them I didn't think it was legal the way that they were going about it, and I had asked if they would give us time to obtain counsel, which we did. It's where that they had asked if we would take and report back at the next meeting, and at that time I think we had it was 3 weeks. So it was a very busy 3 weeks. It's where that it was not fun, but Mr. Londot did an excellent job in representing us. He educated me in the statutory law. And it's where that with all the help from John's office and Bob's office, it's where in the end the subject was dropped.
So they were not going to take it to a vote, they were just going to try to take it?
It was going to come to a vote, but it's where it was, no, it was,
That's what I'm saying.
yeah, no, it was not going to be a vote by the people, it was just going to be a transfer under the direction of the Board of County Commissioners.
and do you see that the attorney, can you analyze the legal, I know you don't know the particulars here, but that seems very peculiar to me that a Board of County Commissioners doesn't go to the meeting and vote and say, we're going to take over the finance function.
The argument is that the legislature specifically gave them that power by statute.
It's not a charter county.
Right. But it's a general provision in the Florida law. My recollection.
A question along these lines. So was the argument really that if they want to duplicate your statutory responsibilities as being the accountant and auditor, that they can come up with money to duplicate it, but they can't take away your statutory responsibilities? Or was it a different argument?
It's the issue that had in ours is where that they were going to. We had just recently hired a new our finance director had retired, and they were actually wanting to take in and wanted us to hire someone that was originally our intent as well, and that was one of the issues that I would say that I aired the way that I handled it. It's where I had gone to the class that we had over in Jacksonville and had listened to the information that Dwight had offered. At that point in time, we decided to hire a CPA for our county. Whenever we did that, it's where the commission wanted to leave us with the auditing power, and that could be handled by our CPA, and we would also have handled our court finance, but then they wanted all the other finance functions to be transferred over to the board.
And I just was under the impression that we have statutory responsibility, which I thought said accountant and auditor, auditor in the Constitution, accountant in the statute, I thought. And therefore, I thought that the whole idea was that they could duplicate the finance function, but they can't say, you don't have the statutory responsibility anymore.
Right, and this was some of the same arguments that our county had to use, our office had to use, because it's really that our stand was that we still had statutory duty to take it forward.
And I think maybe there's a distinction between the finance function and the budget function.
Right.
It's the budget function. It's where our county, we have a county administrator, and it's where that whenever he came on, it's where that the board had asked him to take over those duties because those are his duties as prescribed by statute. They had asked our office to take and work with him on that, and so we continue to do that part. It's where that he is the one that actually presents the budget. Our office puts it together, and we establish a whole paperwork for that.
And again, that's by general law that the Board of County Commissioners has the right to appoint the administrator. Any other questions about the experience in Swanee? Right? Now we're going to turn to Clerk Buddy Irby, who is the chair of the Alachua Charter Review Committee, and let him share his experiences with you.
I wouldn't recommend that, but I was. Our Charter Review Commission has met twice. As Susan said earlier, we adopted the charter in 1987. Then the first time they met was in 1999, I guess, and then 2009, or maybe it was 2000, 2010. So in 2000, we'll say it was 2000, we convinced the county commission that at least one constitutional officer should be on the Charter Review Commission. So we had our sheriff, who'd been around a long time, he agreed to do that. When it came 2010, since the precedent had been set, the constitutional officers felt like one of us should be on it. And I was the dean, more or less, at that time, so they decided I should be the one on it. And so that's how I got the job. And once I got to the commission, then they elected me chairman. I don't know if that was just so I wouldn't talk much, because as chair, you just sort of gavel along and don't get in conversation much. But it did allow us to set the way that we handled the various items that came up. And that's one of the things that becomes really interesting. It's sort of like Forrest Gump's old box of chocolates. When you have the Constitutional Revision Commission or a Charter Revision Commission, it's like you never know what you're going to get when you open that box of chocolates. And we had everybody in the world, or at least Alachua County, coming down and saying, we want to end the charter regulation of airboats. We want to end the charter some environmental issues. We want to end the charter, and they both times in 2000 and 2010, it came up, should we split the office of clerk, comptroller and clerk? And they talked about it a bit, and basically in the end, both times, they just turned to me and said, what do you think? And I said, well, I think we're doing a pretty good job for you. And they said, well, let's drop that and move on. But that doesn't mean that won't happen some other day. But that's just through the relationship that the clerk has with the folks on that commission, that becomes very important. And the trust they have in you as an individual doing the job the right way. But I think that was probably the most interesting thing was we ended up with like, say, 50 or 60 items that people had brought forward and said, we want you to consider this. Now, as chairman, what I did is we had, I want to say there were like 15 members of the commission, I can't remember the exact number, but I required it to be sort of like the legislature. Here's all these ideas out here, but you got to have a sponsor. We're not going to talk about every single thing. And so that narrowed it down, we moved down the process so that we ended up, if nobody on the commission really was dying to talk about it, it never got talked about. And so it boiled it down to maybe, the 5 or 10 issues that were really interesting to the commission. And my stance was that, which was different, and this was a big argument on the commission. There was those commissioners that took a stand, say, on term limits. Never, ever, ever we're going to put term limits on the ballot because I don't agree with it. And then there was, my stance was, though, if there was a great deal of public interest in an item, term limits might have been a bad example, but a lot of interest in the item, and it was legal, and clearly there was going to be one that was well publicly debated and so forth, then I didn't mind sending it to the people to vote on. But in the end, we sent 4 or 5 items to the ballot. 2 passed. One of them dealing with the relationship between cities and counties on environmental issues, and frankly, I can't remember the other one right now. But that was the. But anyway, it was an interesting process. I certainly think the constitutional officers should be represented on any charter revision commission, or if they begin talking about it, the constitutional officers need to get together and decide what you want to do, because the first time it came up in our county, back in the early 80s, we talked about consolidation of Gainesville and Alachua County. We went through that twice. Once we were going to become Gainesville, and the second time we were going to become Alachua County, and neither of those passed, and didn't pass a great deal. Constitutional officers opposed it. Times change, and things get different. But right now in Alachua County, we don't have a lot. We've had two or three initiatives. One of them dealing with campaign finance law. One, they limited contributions to all county candidates to $250, where statewide is $1,000 for any one election. When you turn in reports, I think is in there also. A couple of things like that. A couple of environmental issues have made it to the ballot and passed, but that's sort of the way that it's worked. But the initiative process is one that interests citizens, quite a bit active citizens, that they can actually bring an ordinance to the county commission. The county commission won't pass it, then it goes on the ballot unless the people consider the ordinance. And there's a process for that, an ordinance or a charter amendment. So it's an interesting process to go through. But I would encourage all the clerks to be involved in the process, get all your fellow constitutional officers involved in the process, which I'm sure you would be. And then if you have a revision commission, certainly to be represented there, make sure you got some of your people on there, or be there yourself.
That's not, the only thing that a lot of people don't recognize is that a charter county can actually supersede the ordinances of municipalities in their county, in that county. So, particularly in your more urban counties, and I think almost all your urban counties currently are charter counties.
Yes, pretty much.
Pretty much. And it's the counties that are less urban that tend not to be charter counties. And to some extent, that is, it's one of those things that can be abused, in my opinion, but it's also something that is necessary. If you're trying to do business, and you've got Palm Beach County, I think, has 33 cities in Palm Beach County, and I think Dade has 37 or something. And all those different ordinances, you can't tell when you leave one city and go to the next. Particularly on environmental laws, where water doesn't necessarily know boundaries and other things, and transportation-related issues, those are important. But on the other hand, they can actually take local authority away, and that's one of those issues that I personally, obviously you have it, but it is subject to some abuse, and it's also, I think, in an urban area, much greatly needed.
Well, that's an interesting. I've really wrestled with that issue with the various cities, and that, to a certain extent, is the argument that's made statewide about uniformity, that there are certain issues that are of such statewide importance that we should allow the state to regulate them or preempt certain powers. And, you know, our current Constitution allows for, obviously, the legislature can preempt anything in terms of county charters or city charters. But those are the types of equity arguments that are made on the statewide level, perhaps by the judiciary and the state court system, who says we want a federal system. So, or we want a system where the federal system where the folks work for the judges, work with the judges. So,
There are questions in the back.
yeah.
To Bob's statement, so a municipality has no right or authority to say we don't recognize the charter?
Well, it's a complicated analysis. There's a dual referendum provision that says you can only transfer powers between them with approval by the referendum in the city and the county. So that's one. There's also a provision that says you can have an overarching county policy, and a city, depending on how the charter reads, if there's no charter, the city can exempt themselves from a countywide regulation if there's a city purpose for doing so. But in certain instances, for example, the wellhead protection ordinance, there would be no municipal purpose to say, we have a municipal policy of not protecting the water supply.
But I think it's in the Constitution that says that that relationship has to be defined in a charter.
Correct. That's in Article 8, Section 1.
And just to give you an example, the Leon County Charter, when they originally passed it, they basically put language in that basically said that this would not supersede, if you will, individual municipal ordinances. So that was in the charter. The first thing the county commission, after it passed, wanted to do was to take that out and say, well, that was actually the first amendment they wanted to make to the charter. Said now we want to do that. And in Leon County, the city has been the more progressive, much more environmentally oriented. We're still the only urban county in the state that doesn't have mandatory garbage pickup. So if you live in the unincorporated rural areas of Leon County, you can still
Burn your trash.
and then throw it, take it out in the woods and throw it. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that we don't have that, but that's a different issue.
I can tell you that when you have a charter, either commission or a charter review commission, the League of Cities will have a representative there every time, statewide league, as well as your local league probably, and oftentimes the Florida Association of Counties will have people there also, because they've got these templates that they want to get in your charter.
Can I touch on Buddy's point? Because I know in Pinellas, they always hire a consultant, and the consultant has the blessing of the Florida Association of Counties, and he brings the same, it's like the circus coming to town, he brings the same thing up every time, the same programs. So I know we talk about these relationships, how good they are with our county commission and so forth, but it's a natural conflict relationship that we have to be, like Buddy says, we have to be on guard on these types of things. And they do. They bring up in the same thing, the finance functions should come under that discussion. And what it does, it takes up several commission meetings where they talk about the same topic every time we have a charter review, because this guy brings it up. And basically, by them hiring him, he has the blessings of the county commission, although none of them say they're for this. It becomes a topic of conversation every charter review. So I can tell you, our constitutionals have got together. Susan, you have to put your, and said we're going to visit each of the commission members as soon as they get appointed and talk to them about not hiring that person. And we're going to say to the county commission right away, if you hire that same person again, or the same person from the Florida Association of Counties, you're basically saying you're not looking for a collegial process here. To hire somebody really more of a neutral person to be the consultant. So that's just because that person really drives, that's the staff for the agenda. That's like in any other thing, how much staff drives something, that staff driving the agenda, whoever they hire, especially in big counties, to to staff the charter?
Having had 6 charter commission chairmen, I will say it does depend on who the chairman is of the charter commission. That they will just say, that's off the table, we're not talking about that this time. So it is idiosyncratic. Yes?
Brent?
I would be most happy to talk to any county, especially small counties. I really can't speak about the appropriateness of charter model for maybe larger counties, but I have the distinction of being in the smallest county by far. I would say the next county up to us, I think, is Columbia. Is anybody in Columbia? I'm not sure if they've got 3, 4, 5 times our population, something like that. Anyway, so I might say a couple things that might not be politically correct, which is not to say that it's not a good idea for larger counties. But to me, it appears to me that our charter is one of those examples of if it's not broke, fix it until it is.
It's not broke, break it.
So they started out bringing the guy in, hiring the consultant, and started out by telling us it's not going to cost anything, and then they hired a consultant, $10,000, and then we had our first, this was in 2008 when it passed, we had our first charter review commission already, and in the meantime, we had 5 referendum items on the ballot this fall. 4 of them came from the committee, the charter review committee, all of which passed. 1 came from a citizen petition. We have a very high threshold for signatures. You have to get 30% of the registered voters in each of the 5 districts. That was probably as high as anything. They got that because they went to all the gas stations and restaurants and couldn't really leave until you signed.
Gas station?
Yeah.
What's that? But anyway, they quickly spent a $5,000 budget. I mean, right off the bat, and I don't know what the total cost actually was when they got finished with it this time. But in any case, the thing that failed in the referendum was the petition drive. Of all things, it was an environmental issue. It failed like 55-45. The other things all passed very large margins, and they were things like nonpartisan elections, which is really intended to avoid us having like 5 people running in the general election and somebody winning 21% of the vote, something weird like that. But it's been a whirlwind of activity, and I would be most happy to talk to any of you if you really get the sense that there's a local building, especially in a small county, because I firmly believe, and call me a conspiracy theorist or something, but I firmly believe that all the people that were outspoken in support of the starter or charter had something else in mind. I don't think they were like, oh, we finally arrived, now we have to start a charter. So I'd be happy to talk to any of y'all.
Brent, I was surprised when I looked at the list that McCullough was on there. What was the driving force that got it passed the first time?
Well, we had a very progressive county administrator who went around and spoke to all the civic clubs and said, we're running county government based on a system from the 1800s. And everybody's like, oh my God, this is horrible. We got to do something about this. And I wanted to stand up and say, we're running the United States of America, presumably on a system that was from the 1700s.
That would definitely pass.
Yeah. But I believe it was driven by a group of people that wanted to do some local referendums that were pretty upset with the commission. I also believe at the time there was a fair amount of frustration with the sheriff who's been there a long time. He was very powerful, and I sort of thought that could have been part of it too. There were no real problems that were obvious. It was just seen as a progressive thing to do, and oddly enough, some of the people that were on the commission now, they're like, why did I think that was really all that good of an idea?
And I think we have another question.
Just a comment first, a question for Brent. Didn't your progressive county manager also run the budget in the ground?
Yes, the same one. That's correct.
You're being videotaped.
Do what now? He did what?
Run the budget.
The county administrator, in addition to getting charter passed, put the county in a severe deficit that took Bryant several years to dig out from under. And then after he got it into fiscal distress, he immediately took a job somewhere else. But speaking of money, we've talked to a number of clerks who had charter movements that were surfacing in their county, and the thing we've stressed to them is what the charter really is all about is money. And what it really is after is your citizens' money, because they're going to implement new taxes that they could not implement any other way. And if you phrase the charter, now this isn't true for counties that have charter today because you already have it in place, but for a constitutional county, if you ask your citizens, do you want a charter that's going to give you all these great things, home rule, they're all going to say yes. If you say, do you want a charter that's going to, add taxes on your pocketbook, they're all going to say no. And that's the thing I find interesting throughout this whole process is that's like a little dirty little secret that never gets brought out into the open light, is that you're going to see on your cell phones, on your cable TV, you're going to see all these new little fees added, and they do add up, but it's $1 here, $1 there, $1 there. But for your county commission, that's real money that they're going to get to spend. And that's really where I think constitutional officers can provide some education to the public.
I think that's the driver in most of them, is the utility taxes.
And we did that. Forgot that part of the story. We've got it now.
Okay. I
And
think we all.
constitutionally, charter counties in some instances are treated the same way cities are. They're given municipal powers as a charter county that you don't have as a constitutional county. Yes.
I think we should hear something from the Pasco folks and tell us what you're going through right now, because I think that's the legislator, a powerful legislator trying to appoint a charter review commission. And at first, I think he was going to appoint all the members of the charter review commission. So tell us where y'all are, who's brave enough to call us up here to speak for Pasco County. Because Pasco's the largest county that's not a charter county population-wise. They're like 480,000. Yeah.
We're at the very beginning stage.
Everyone here, yeah.
And the others might want to chime in, because we're at the very beginning stage, so we're learning about it right now. It's been proposed, but our county commission, as I'm reading, has kind of put a delay on the conversation so they can learn more and distribute some information, the way I understand it, to more constituents.
But what's interesting with this is the county commission's against basically having a charter review commission, and you have a legislator pushing to have mandate they have. So it's coming from the total opposite direction I've ever heard in anywhere in the state of Florida. But that's happening in Pasco County.
And it is.
Does anyone know why? Does anyone have?
Go ahead.
There must be some
Tell us
kind
the
of
reason. Well, we think part of the reason is that constitutional officers have higher salaries than legislators, and after they get term limited out of their legislative position, they may be looking to term limit existing constitutional officers or charter or county commissioners, so that those offices become vacant.
So beware, that's.
I do have a question about the term, because it seems like, I have read about what happened in law, but a lot of times when the charter occurs, a mayor position is created. Is that position termed as well?
It can be either way.
Why don't
Usually is
you talk
local
about
option.
that tally and
Yeah,
just where all
I'll go
that,
through
where all
that
that
now.
is? Because we're going
Okay.
in our last 10 minutes.
I'll try to give you, I think we've talked about abolishing the constitutional office. I think we've talked about reducing your compensation, which I think is probably unconstitutional. Let's talk now about term limits. And there are 20 charter counties, 11 of them have term limits. The earliest was 1957, the latest was 2008. And I did review each of the specific languages. There were, right. There may have been subsequent actions past date. So the provisions that come into play, I took Mrs. Mr. Blaker's case up. Mr. Cook was, I believe, or maybe Miss Cook was the clerk of Mr. Cook, I thought it was Mr. and Mrs. Blaker were the two clerks. Their term limits cases and charter cases were joined, and we took them up to the Supreme Court, and I represented Mrs. Blaker and the sheriff. There was one ballot question, all the constitutional officers, all of the county commissioners in the same ballot question, all term limited. So what was interesting to me in Cook when it came down was, and this is, I think, a pretty persuasive argument for you, was that the Cook case, and I'm quoting from it, said that we should look to a case called Thomas versus State, ex rel. Cobb, from 1952. So 50 years apart, in 2002 and in 1952, the Supreme Court said, we want you to look to what George Washington did. I was thinking, well, I better figure out what that is. So I got the biography. I mean, I have a pretty good idea of what George Washington did because I went to Washington Lee, and his canal stock paid part of my tuition at law school. But I didn't really look into his theory of term limits. And his theory of term limits is your theory of term limits. He opposed term limits. And in his farewell address, which was quoted in the Thomas case, and what both Cook and Thomas said 50 years apart is, we tell people how to get elected in the Constitution, and you can't put any additional qualifiers on there. Term limits is an additional qualification. It prevents somebody from running for office that he's constitutionally entitled to do. So the previous case, the Thomas case, there was a guy who graduated from Emory. He had an education degree. I think he had a doctorate. And the local county commission decided, or charter commission decided, you had to have a Florida State instructional certificate that you could only get if you attended a Florida university. And you couldn't run for the school superintendent unless you had one of those. And so he took that up to the Supreme Court, and they said that's an additional qualification of office. At that point, that was a state constitutional office. And they said no. You know, you can't put any additional qualifiers on there. That's unconstitutional. And they quoted from Washington's farewell address, in which he said, if, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of constitutional powers be in any way wrong, let it be corrected by a constitutional amendment, which is to say, let's don't just read in additional qualifications. So, if you look at the Founding Fathers, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson supported term limits. Alexander Hamilton and George Washington thought term limits were a mistake. And yet, we didn't have a constitutional amendment to establish term limits until 1951 in Florida when we voted on it. Every president deferred to President Washington. And when he removed himself from office, it was such a worldwide event that it was analyzed by his biographer. First of all, George III just thought he was an amazing human being to not become the king of the United States.
Susan, we're almost out of time. I can get you just to focus on what's the current status in Florida.
The current status of Telly is it's final.
What's final?
Telly is final.
What does that mean?
What that means is that they can now term limit.
Any office.
Right.
Now, what does that mean to places like Pinellas? Is it in your charter still? They got out of your charter. Jackson
never was in our charter.
I didn't codify it, so they couldn't revise it. I was going to talk about the revivification doctrine, but because if you have a provision in your charter limiting your terms that during Cook, after Telly, theoretically, it became revived. And that's what happened to Antunes, in the Antunes case in Sarasota.
So in Jacksonville or any other place where the term limits
In
is now legal in
Jacksonville,
Florida.
the clerk in Jacksonville attempted to maintain his office.
Right.
And the same judge who decided, the trial judge who decided Cook, went through an extensive discussion of how he was disqualified from his office by the Telly opinion because it had been adopted 8 years prior, which kept him from running for office because it was revived.
The bottom line is if a charter or charter revision commission now wants to go after term limits for
It's
constitutional officers or county commissioners, now constitutional.
Yes.
Now let's focus on those last 2 minutes on, we've got another big constitutional revision commission coming up shortly.
That's right.
Can you just give us
Well, and that's the George Washington argument. That's the constitutional argument. You know, do we have a check and balance? Do we have a watchdog? Or do we have statewide efficiency? Those are the overarching arguments for your office being abolished or term limited or reduced or the constitutional status being abolished. So, you know, if you think like the Federalist Papers and Alexander Hamilton, you think we really like to have a check and balance, that that's important, that power tends to become more powerful unless it's checked, and clerks are that check.
Well, as Ken told us yesterday, they're going to appoint the membership in 2017, and he outlined the members, some 115 by the governor, 8 by the...
37 altogether. Go ahead, there it is.
Okay, 15, 9, 9, and 3.
Yeah, you got it. 15 by the governor.
There you go.
There we go.
And these are very, those of you who do clerks that were on here in 97, and this was voted on in 98 last time, I can tell you, you'll get gray hair watching this group. And it's because it's really the box of chocolates. You never know what's going to come out. And so this is some of the association, John and Brent as the future leadership here. And this is going to be a big deal for you guys to really make sure we got the right team up there all the time.
We need to give them lots of issues to talk about that have nothing to do with clerks.
That's right.
That box of chocolate.
All right, well, I think we'll take any questions up here about your own charters or experiences that you have. We can have further discussion here as well, if you would like to discuss.
I think the main thing to take away is there's reasons for charters and reasons not to have charters. You have to make that decision, but in the end, the voters make the decision once then it's how it's promoted or how it's opposed. And so it's an interesting process, but you can almost figure that around the state, I'm really surprised the Marions and the Pascos aren't there yet, because I can assure you the Florida Association of Counties are pushing for all counties to be charter counties, I would think. And so this is going to, it's going to continue. I didn't count the counties, but it's an interesting process, interesting subject. I appreciate Susan coming in. Let's give her a hand for you have the 3 B's, Bob, Buddy, and Barry. But Barry, Bob, Buddy, and Barry. And that's Jeff doing this here. Anyway, we appreciate everybody participating today. And we know it's been a long day, and so we appreciate y'all taking the time to be with us. Thank you so much.